And again, you just said it, we're not a DeFi company, we're a Web 3.0 company, which means you're thinking bigger.
And Web 3 is more about how you could actually keep your data, keep your keys, keep your finances, and decide like what do you share, and also like how you transact. If you go to a bank and you deposit funds, it's pretty much like being in some sort of like a Web 1.2 realm where you are like actually trusting someone. But Web 3 is about where you don't need to trust a centralized party, you actually control your keys. If you control your keys, you control your Bitcoin, your Ethereum. When you compare like decentralized finance to traditional finance, what amazes me like how transparent everything is. So if you go currently into the Aave protocol or any DeFi protocol out there, you see each and every transaction on the blockchain, every single second. I'm more about into like financial inclusion and how to scale this to everyone. So people can actually build things, focus on creativity and jobs that are interesting, and doing that on a full-time basis, how you can actually do something that you love from the first day and you're financially able to do that.
The idea of a billionaire bothers you because you're thinking if you distributed that capital to potentially thousands of other people, they could be productive in the community doing something they love and add value.
Basically, when everyone has equal opportunity, like you become more creative and you can build things and you have less worry about finances. And how to scale that globally, that's the kind of like a challenge. And maybe blockchain and cryptocurrencies have a like very big place in that, actually making it happen.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Stani Kulechov, the technologist, entrepreneur, decentralized finance innovator, and thought leader. At 13 years old in Helsinki, Finland, you started programming code before discovering Ethereum and realized how it could massively impact the traditional financial system. In 2017, you founded ETHLend, one of the first decentralized peer-to-peer lending platforms, and in 2018 rebranded it as Aave, which during the DeFi summer of 2020 became the biggest DeFi credit market in the world, reaching over $1.5 billion in total value locked. Today, Aave has $19 billion in deposits, $8.5 billion in borrowing, making you the leading decentralized finance asset platform in the world and a true pioneer in the space. Stani, welcome to London Real.
Thanks, Brian. Very, very excited to be here.
Good. I'm so excited to have you here. And look, you are one of the OGs of the DeFi ecosystem. And OG means original gangster. For people that don't know, and I've had Ice-T in here who knows a bit about original gangsters, well, so I can say that.
I'm not so cool as Ice-T, but you know that's pretty nice. I mean, everyone feels to be like OG in the space because things are very early still. So everyone will be an OG end of the day.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I want to talk about everything you've been here. But without the work that Aave did in 2020, I would argue there would not be the DeFi market as we know it today.
Correct.
And I think there was some amazing work done last summer. And I want to talk about what it was like to be there, and of course, how you built it and what the future looks like as well. Quick background on me, just so we can get on the same page. I actually started coding when I was 10 or 11 years old. My mom bought me an Apple II Plus computer when I was in San Diego, California, and I started programming like BASIC or something. And then I went to a junior high school that taught Fortran and Pascal. So I actually was gonna be a kind of a coder, and even took some assembly language back in the day.
Oh, wow.
Ended up going to MIT, but I got seduced by Wall Street. And I went from MIT to Wall Street in 1993. They were hiring rocket scientists to come in and help them price complex financial derivative markets. And I was in the fixed income market, which you're in basically as well. And fixed income basically means the debt markets.
Exactly.
And Wall Street, people think about stockbrokers, But the big money on Wall Street is in fixed income because it's so much bigger as a market. And I got placed on this desk at a company called Bankers Trust. And we were probably one of the pioneers when it came to fixed income derivatives. And we knew how to price options, all sorts of yield instruments, you name it. And we were doing some of the most complex stuff out there. And I got to learn on the floor with a bunch of crazy Gordon Gekko type people. I mean, it was really intense. And again, the yield curve is something that we used to talk about.
Yeah.
It's kind of a description of the return you get on an asset from, say, 1 day out to 30 years. And in the US, the fixed income market, it's really deep. You've got US Treasuries, you've got a fixed floating swap book, which I worked on for a long time. And so I got to see this thing in action, and we were doing some original gangster shit there.
That's
as
OG.
well. Yeah, that's OG. So I got into that, and I really enjoyed it. Later, I went to the credit markets. I came to London. I did credit derivatives for 10 years, which was, again, very interesting. And then in 2011, I had enough, as I told you out there. I got tired of being a greedy banker, and I started broadcasting London Real. So the past 10 years, we haven't been talking about DeFi because there was no DeFi then, but we did talk to Max Kaiser in 2013, and he was screaming about Bitcoin. Andreas Antonopoulos was here in 2015, 2017, 2019. I'm sure you've listened to his lectures and seen him. Yeah. Andreas was telling us about the Internet of Money and the future before it happened, before you guys built it. And so we had these conversations, but it didn't really click for us. Then last year, we kind of fought openly with YouTube about freedom of speech. I ran for mayor of London, just because you saw the pictures out there.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and then we didn't win in May, and then we decided when we came back to really focus on something new, and I looked at DeFi, and I thought, oh my God. I looked at the value locked up in Aave. I looked at the DeFi summer, and I saw, I think at one point it was nearly 100 billion in total value locked in the network. Yeah. I saw innovation and the rate of innovation I hadn't seen since I was on Wall Street. And I had a bank with 20,000 employees with a balance sheet and a direct line to the Fed. And we were doing this innovation. And I could see now you've got 10 guys and a dog in Tel Aviv, right? Or 9 girls and a cat in St. Petersburg. And they're putting out these DeFi protocols. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is impressive. And I thought we better go in on this. So we decided to go all in for the next 10 years. And we started having conversations with people like you. So that brings me up to now. Obviously, the DeFi summer of last year was an amazing explosion in instruments that most people didn't even understand necessarily, borrowing and lending. And I still have some of my students in my DeFi Academy saying, why is this important? Why is this important? But it is important. So I want to talk to you about why this is such an important building block of the marketplace. I also want to say that my mother, 76-year-old Betty Rose in San Diego, as of Sunday, owns crypto.
Amazing. That's a big achievement.
It's big.
It's getting everywhere now.
Yeah, she's spent her whole life investing in real assets, and now she's continuing, obviously digital assets, but she owns property. She's comfortable with property. Just like Robert Kiyosaki of Rich Dad Poor Dad, he's comfortable with property. And now she's on MetaMask. She's got ETH, some stablecoin, and some Chainlink. My daughter at 17 has the same. So, and she's very comfortable with it. And the last thing I said to her on Sunday night, I said, Mom, do you know how you could go to the bank right now and finance one of your properties? She paid them all off, by the way, over 30 years of mortgages. She said, yeah. And I said, you know how it takes paperwork and the bank takes a cut and it's a big pain? I said, you could finance your coins right now on a place like Aave. And she said, wow. So that's real world back to this DeFi world, but it's happening and it's happening really quick. So much to talk to you about. Let's talk about August 25th last year when CoinDesk comes out and says, Aave is now the biggest lending protocol in the world. Obviously, you didn't get that overnight. What was that day like? What was the summer like? And maybe explain to people, what was the DeFi summer and what were you guys doing then?
Yeah, I mean, everything kind of like started back in a few years ago with our first kind of like a protocol, itLend, and that was pretty much like the like kind of like a bird-stones in decentralized finance. So we created a protocol where you can pretty much borrow against your assets, cryptographic assets. And it didn't get much traction because there wasn't that many users and, protocols didn't talk to each other. There was one decentralized exchange where you could swap your digital assets. So we kind of created this lending part for the ecosystem. But I would say like last year, especially like in year before, we started to see more composability where you had developers like us building something, other developers, different part of the world building another kind of building block, and someone else coming and building on top of this too. And you have this kind of like a financial Legos stacking on top and creating products. And when that started to become like this composability more obvious, we started to get more and more products and more bigger ecosystem. And builders became users, and then actually they started to build more products. Like we started to build more protocols that are just more functional. For example, back in the days, we created a protocol where you created practically a loan offer or a loan request to get funded, and now you just come to the Aave protocol, which has the Aave protocol itself is decentralized, which means that no one actually controls these protocols. Like no one controls the Bitcoin protocol or Ethereum protocol. It runs currently on multiple different chains. One of the chains is Ethereum blockchain. And it means that if you want to have any kind of a change in the protocol itself, you have to go through this governance process. So the users, the stakeholders come together, vote on different decisions, and those smart contracts will change. And we, as the builders of the protocol, can't change it. So that's the kind of like how the protocols work. And you have like 100 access points there. So you can just come and deposit your cryptographic assets and earn. It just became very simple. But to get to this point, it took like a few years of like different kinds of implementations. And because we were building an open system, so when we built something and deploy it to the blockchain network, someone else can come and copy what we built, improve it, and build something better. And this constant innovation cycle led to products that are actually usable by your grandma, your daughter, and that's why we are here. And without them, without this innovation cycle, and all these builders, we will not be in this kind of like a DeFi summer, and Aave will not exist. So it's kind of like the success of Aave is the success of the whole DeFi ecosystem and the builders, I would say.
And that whole open source aspect, that's something that's typical of the blockchain and crypto space in general, but you guys probably really made a push, right? To give these protocols as soon as possible to your community and your developers. And which again it's almost against the old capitalistic model, right?
Yeah.
Steve Jobs would roll over in his grave.
For sure.
Because the app and the app store is all about control and they take money on the back of it.
Yeah.
You in the space, and Aave particularly, you're like, take the code because that's the way we grow. And also that's the right thing to do. Yeah,
and if you look at something like Microsoft and how Bill Gates run Microsoft, it's always about proprietary and moats. How do you build moats, for example? And then open source. That
concept of moats is a big thing, right?
Exactly.
To keep people out of your castle.
Exactly. Right? So you basically have something like this kind of defensibility. But end of the day, like, and open source used to be like in software that, you use it in some way to attract a community and attract developers, and then you still build a proprietary product on top of it.
Right.
But here in DeFi, you don't have any modes. So kind of like a software. So whatever you build openly, you create it and you put it in the public, and then you want people to use it and build other things on top. So you kind of like just be a part of building something bigger. And the kind of like only mode you have as a team is pretty much the talent you have and things you can build and the brand. So let's say the more you build very interesting things and experiment, the more kind of like attractive you become in the space and people follow what you are doing. And for example, we don't see Aave as the developer team any kind of like a DeFi. We're not a DeFi company. We're basically a team that builds Web3. So we built one part of decentralized finance. Now we're focusing on building a social graph, decentralized social graph, and tomorrow we might be focusing on maybe decentralized e-commerce. So our goal is just to build the Web3 and the pieces that are now missing.
Okay, let's talk about, you said Web 3.0, and maybe we define it really quickly, because a lot of people in your ecosystem think about Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and again, you just said it, we're not a DeFi company, we're a Web 3.0 company, which means you're thinking bigger. How do you explain that Web 1, 2, and 3 to people, like your mom?
Yeah, I would say kind of like Web 1 is where, things went, like internet became a kind of like obviously like a public network. Then Web 2 is more about, you started to kind of like see decentralized companies becoming, bigger usage. So instead of like you storing your data, you give up your data into let's say, if you use social media to social media companies, and you kind of are trusting centralized service providers. And Web3 is more about how you can actually keep your data, keep your keys, keep your finances, and decide like what do you share, and also like how you transact. Because, for example, it's not about software, it's also about services. For example, if you go to a bank and you deposit funds, it's pretty much like being in a some sort of like a Web 1.2 realm where you are like actually trusting someone. But Web3 is about where you don't need to trust a centralized party. You actually control your keys. If you control your keys, you control your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, your deposits into the Aave protocol or some other DeFi protocol. You might control your social graph network because you have the keys. So it's all about, there isn't anymore this idea of centralized kind of like a network or a party that you are giving up your data and you're feeding them, which are using that data to sell your services. Instead, you're practically having everything on your own possession, first time kind of like with the use of technology. And that's pretty much like Web3. It's a long explanation, but maybe because there's just so many things happening at the same time.
It's a really important concept, and I don't think it's one as humans that we're even used to. I had Sandeep, the COO of Polygon, and he said, Brian, this isn't technology, it's a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
He said a couple hundred years ago, maybe in Finland, or maybe here in the UK, we had kings that told us what to do, and queens, and we were like, okay, now we have governments, then we have banks, and now we have, Facebook and Google. But at the end of the day, we don't really own our money because the bank has custody of it. The government kind of tells us what to do. Facebook controls our data. I broadcast on YouTube, but I found out last year that they might stop me at some point.
Exactly. So you need basically some sort of decentralized social media where you can broadcast like in a way where you can decide like what the audience basically can see. So it's all about decentralization where actually, and part of the decentralization isn't even like the censorship resistance, but that it's actually not anymore centralized kind of like entities deciding things, but communities deciding instead. So for example, the Aave protocol example where not Aave, not any centralized party is controlling the protocol. Instead, there's a community that decides like what kind of assets could be listed in the future into the protocol that you can borrow against, what stablecoins could be added there, how the protocol could be upgraded and changed. It goes from the idea of like, hey, let's trust Google, Facebook, JPM, or SHBC into something like, hey, let's decide as a community how we will build in the future. And the interesting part here is that there's always a minority in the community, and you never want to kind of like, you have to take the ideas of the minority as well, because there's always a risk in an open source system where if you don't have a wide consensus, they can always fork your code and create a spin-off community. Right. And that actually creates this competition and constant mindfulness that you need to ensure that everyone is kind of like working towards the same direction, and you can't be, you have to be very altruistic when you govern these protocols.
Right, and I think you're a big fan of the hard fork threat being an important part of governance, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that at some point people could leave. Like my daughter, she's 17, she lives at home. If my rules get too draconian, she'll leave. She's like, I'm going to move in with my friend. I'll be like, oops, like I didn't want to go that far. I want you to be part of this family. I just want you to stop misbehaving. Yeah. And so it's true with the community. If people have seen in the past, I think Ethereum Classic, Bitcoin Cash, these are instruments that decided to go their own ways with their own rules and try to go it alone. And that sometimes can split up a community and split up liquidity, but also it can keep everybody on the same page, right? And it can keep the right things happening with the right protocol.
Exactly, and also it creates, I would say, like an alternative, whatever already exists. And maybe if two different kinds of groups are innovating, maybe we'll see two different alternatives, in terms of innovation. And it gives also space for new people to come in and build things. So I think like forking is good. And some forks are meme forks, some fork might, there was one decentralized protocol that basically had a complete meme fork that became actually a very substantial protocol in terms of like how much value it has in the smart contracts. But it's always like a good to have this thread, that, if you become like a dictator in the protocol as a larger stakeholder, there's always a risk that the minority can just fork it and create something better, and they have chances to thrive, especially because they can create incentives in a cryptographic way. So I think blockchain is not only about decentralization, but decentralization plus incentives, because we had, distributed models, peer-to-peer system, file sharing, whatnot, but they never were beyond like this barter economy where you share a song and basically I share a song and we exchange.
Napster.
Exactly.
But there was no way to quantify value or transfer value.
Exactly. And now you first time ever, you have like crypto economics, you have incentives, you can organize decentralized fashion as an organization, vote on things, and everything is based on this smart contract based software. So that makes a big difference now and why it's a big movement at the end of the day.
Yeah, when I watched what you guys were doing, so I call that, when I relooked at DeFi, when I was at Bankers Trust, I had a bunch of direct phone lines and I could choose which broker to use at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the Bond Future. I could choose which company to trade treasuries with. And they would give me better liquidity and they might take me out for a steak dinner or take me to the Knicks on the floor. But I never got offered ownership in their company or the protocol. Yeah. And when I saw you guys in the DeFi Summer and some of the lending protocols saying, guess what? We'll give you an interest so you'll grow your crypto. That's the best way you explain a lending market. You get to grow your crypto, but you also get some of these extra tokens in this protocol that will also accrue value. That is a mind-blowing concept that you would have never seen in traditional finance or probably impossible to do without a blockchain.
Or in economy. Imagine even taking a Uber ride. Each time you take a Uber ride, you get a small portion of Uber equity. Or eating at, let's say, drinking in a pub or going out somewhere or watching a sports game, you get part of like ownership of that sports club. So like all of this concept of like ownership it's what Web3 does very well is that it just like changes the way. So as a user, you become a stakeholder. So basically, because you use the products and the protocols, you have the kind of like a most skin in the game to decide like how they will be built compared where, a traditional model where you have a company, stakeholders, investors, and investors are kind of like incentivized to create products that create more value for them. So they have like the monetary stake, but the user has not only kind of like, user has the stake of like using a good product. And then if you get like some sort of like discounts, ownerships and additional like kind of like yield for that, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a whole new paradigm shift and it's super exciting. And it's also all on the blockchain.
Yeah,
right?
And transparently. That's the thing. Like when you compare like decentralized finance to traditional finance, what amazes me like how transparent everything is. So if you go currently into the Aave protocol or any DeFi protocol out there, you see each and every transaction on the blockchain, every single second. So you see like what's the collateralization ratios on the Aave protocol, what kind of assets are borrowed, what kind of interest rates. You see like the historical data, so you can even quantify for the future. So these protocols are auditable by anyone every single second, which means that anyone can build better risk management tools as well, and because the data is accurate there. Compared, for example, financial crisis in 2008, it's very difficult to understand like what kind of exposures, for example, JPM had against Goldman and Goldman against, let's say, Bank of America and whatnot. And so you have like this financial reporting, but it's not the same thing as you have like financial reporting on the whole state of the economy each and single second, which means that anyone can build better risk management tools any part of the world. And that's what's happening in the Aave protocol. We saw a proposal coming from a firm called Gauntlet, which does stress testing and risk management in the Web3, and they practically make it a proposal of changing risk parameters. And it's kind of like a decentralized way of building not just like better finance, more like efficient, but also like more risk-aware finance, which is good for everyone, especially for the users.
Yeah, the transparency cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
When I worked on Wall Street, the whole game was secrecy.
Exactly.
The whole game was a lack of information
and
from your
running,
customers. That's why we got paid millions of dollars a year. If you ever look at those phones in the movie Wall Street, they're these black phones, and I used to have two. I could talk on two phones at once, by the way. They have a click. They have a clicker in the middle of the phone. What's that for? It's to mute, so you cannot tell people information.
Exactly.
And we would do massive derivative trades, hundreds of millions of dollars in notional, between banks, and they were never reported to anyone. And that's why I think what Stani's referring to is in the financial crisis, when everything went wrong, the Fed comes in and says, okay, where's the risk? And everyone says,
no one knows.
We don't know.
Yeah.
It's all on a ISDA document that was signed off that's 8 pages long, or it's in a risk management system internally to the bank. But you literally have no idea what the risk is.
Exactly.
And then it starts getting ugly, as it did with Lehman and these other places. But our job was literally not to tell our customers information.
Exactly, and that's not possible in Web3 because like you see everything. And end of the day, what amazes me how these communities are managing risk. So all of these communities, they consist of developers. There might be some professionals there, but they're users that are using these protocols and practically making decisions on what kind of risk parameters to apply. And crypto is very volatile. It's volatile than anything else. And when these collaterals reduce in value, there's this kind of like a liquidations going on the different protocols, and they have been very resilient on what's happened this year in the big market drop and last year. So it's just showcases that you don't need to be a financial kind of like a advocate to actually build good protocols and risk-averse systems. You just need to have a group of people as a community, like using the product and deciding that, hey, what's good for the product, and that will work. We have like basically multiple protocols now in DeFi that just have amazing risk management, and I'm pretty sure when we look back into this thing, like we get inspired that you don't need to have like necessarily like similar backgrounds just modeling risk. You can just have people that are using and have a lot of like kind of like a stake in the system.
And it's been impressive because, like you said, it's almost like a public display of a stress test.
Yes.
That's been out there. And I was talking to Dan Moorhead of Pantera Capital, who was raising Bitcoin funds in 2013, who tried to buy $2 million of Bitcoin on CoinDesk and on Coinbase, and there were 4 employees, and he couldn't get it done. And he said, Brian, look at Bitcoin, for example. He said, for 13 years, it's been stress tested by every terrorist group, every government group, every CIA, FBI group in the world, and yet it's never had downtime. He said, you can't say that about any banking system in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't say that about Facebook and Google. They've all had downtime. And yet a network like Bitcoin has made it through that without breaking. Yeah. And again, Ethereum now, all the developers, all the protocols. And again, you're talking about big market moves. So Black Thursday last year, with this year when Bitcoin comes off 50%, now what happens? Do the stable coins stay stable? Do I get my lending securities back? And we're seeing these public displays of kind of a stress test, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion. So if you see some sort of like a kind of like unwanted behavior, the communities will talk about it, publicly in the forums, in Twitter, and you quickly the communities react very quickly. And because it's a system where it's based on the communities, it's very difficult to act against a protocol, and kind of because everyone is trying to achieve the very same goal. Of course, when things scale, and you have more commercial actors going, the next question is how you keep the protocols somehow I would say like a friendly environments where people care about decentralization, financial inclusion. But that's the thing with the forking. If there's some sort of issues where the community members aren't, they don't see it as kind of beneficial for the protocol, they can always fork. And this risk is amazing because you can't fork JPM, you can't fork Bank of America. It's just it takes 50 years to get to the same level. But in DeFi, you can basically fork Aave, you can fork any protocol. And if you do it right way, you can get very quickly in the same spot. And that's something that also keeps us kind of active, how we ensure as a stakeholder, we build good protocols for people.
So you're a politician, not a CEO.
Well, I would say that I'm more of a builder. I don't like politics because it takes so much time, but politics is an important part. So decentralized finance is interesting because there's this component of building things, and then there's this component of governing things. I'm more of a builder. I like to build things and let other people to govern them. That's pretty much my vision. But also I like to, I have a saying in some of the things I build. So maybe I want to say, hey, I like what's happening, but my opinion is this. But I want to do it in a way that my social capital isn't saturating what's good for the protocol. So that's the thing. Even if you deploy things, for example, Vitalik created the Ethereum founded it, and he's active there. The community is still, this kind of like a social capital, you need to be careful because you need to ensure that you don't direct too much the whole community and let this kind of space and involvement there.
It's a fine line.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen it go too wrong, I don't think, although there were a bunch of co-founders of Ethereum. They all kind of went their separate ways.
Yeah.
You got the dot founder, you got Charles Hoskinson doing Cardano. We'll talk about Cardano later. I know you have an opinion about that. But it is a weird place where you're thought leader, politician, CEO, and also you're supposed to be building and coding a little in your spare time too, right?
Yeah, exactly. And have some free time as well on top of that.
It's a lot to do. Yeah. You look pretty good actually for a guy.
Yeah, thank you.
Now I just spent 6 months running to be mayor of London, and I got a taste of politics, taste. And in America, you look at America now, and you see a few hard fork opportunities, right? And again, there's also innovation there.
Yeah.
So look at the way Florida and Texas dealt with the pandemic, and they chose different things to do versus California and New York, and they got different results and different economies, and people move there on the back of it, which is kind of maybe a hard fork vote in some way. If you move from one protocol to another, call it a state. So you can see how politics has this as well. When I ran for London, you can't necessarily hard fork London, although there are, 32 boroughs and each one makes some independent decision making. But also politics can be a little frustrating. There's a book written in America called The Tyranny of the Majority, right? I mean, majority rule sounds good and it's how democracy works.
Exactly, and you can't fork. You're kind of like stuck. So you have to like grow the minority. But in Web3, what happens is that with decentralization, you can basically take that code and fork it and say that, okay, this is our vision, this is how we're going to differentiate. If you're early, you get more incentivized. And people follow. Some people follow just because of the incentives, and some people follow because of the frustration. But this kind of like a forking ensures that you have an ecosystem where if there isn't large enough consensus, which is important in decentralization, because otherwise you are back into the centralized model. So what happens is that you don't have wide consensus, you see forks and they evolve something. And some of the forks might be opportunistic, they don't go anywhere. I'm not sure like many of the Bitcoin forks will survive at some point, but then again, when you have, let's say, forks on Ethereum on certain protocols, there might be like a different way of building things, and that's totally fine. So I think that will be like the key thing. And we don't see forks often because it's very radical measure. It's kind of like rage quitting from a DAO, but it's just a way of when you need to radically take a new direction of what you're building.
Yeah. And again, you spoke earlier about how composability is a really important piece, which means what you build is a piece of Lego that other people can use to go create whatever they want. And the more you can make it complete and not owned by you, that's a big part of the protocol, as well as you like this concept of immutable code, of having this piece of code out there that's a smart contract in and of itself and does something, and again, doesn't have...
And no one can change it,
right.
That's the kind of like perfect thing to do. But there's also issues related to that. I think like a perfect protocol is when you build something, only the most necessary part of the protocol, and deploy it and see what other people will build. So you have this kind of like a protocol, I would say like experimentation market fit or protocol market fit, where you try something and see how the community reacts and what they can build. Because if you start to build everything in a monolithic way, what happens is you get a community of more of like a spectators or maybe parameters governors. But what you want to essentially do is that you don't want to only decentralize people who govern the protocol, but you want to decentralize also people who build the protocol. So that way, kind of like if the governance wants to make different kinds of decisions and the builders aren't happy, you don't have anyone to implement those changes. And for example, in Aave protocol, you can delegate the voting power. So if you are a holder of Aave, you can delegate to someone so-called protocol politician, but you can also delegate the proposition power, which means that as if you look into the traditional system, usually like the lawmaking is monopolized in a way that you have one lawmaker and then you have politicians who vote in different kind of like ways. But delegating proposition power means that you make the code makers, lawmakers to compete on the proposals which these protocol politicians end of the day vote. And that's why the decentralization of builders is like the last and biggest component that we need to kind of like work upon in the whole space. But in the perfect manner, you create a protocol that just has the essentials and see how others will build on top. That's like the most like valuable scenario.
Why did Aave win? Maker started before you, Compound started before you, but Aave's got clearly the leader. Why did you guys win?
I think it's because of the inclusivity and the way we are build everything. So we always try to be very inclusive when we, let's say, tap into different communities, list assets, look into other kind of like a change when we're building. For example, we listed different kinds, as a community, we listed like different kinds of assets that, for example, other more, I would say like maximalism community members will not approve. We listed Tether before anyone else as a lending currency. It's still a lending currency, not a collateral. Wrapped BTC, so we were able to unlock the value of wrapped BTC than anyone else.
So Bitcoin as a lending instrument.
Exactly,
you did it with
on Ethereum, yeah.
Right.
And the same, we were in Polygon, like Sandeep, we had as well. So kind of like, and now like expanding. So our community has been very inclusive, and this inclusiveness has been very rewarding. So in terms of assets and Link community was one of the first we listed, and it gave a lot of traction as well. It's just like kind of like seeing where are those communities that are untapped and going and servicing them. It's just like, we could imagine if there's a world somewhere where people don't have mobile phones and you go and give them mobile phones or give them internet connection, satellite connection, you give cars, people will be happy. And the thing what we did, like, of course, like we didn't give physical objects, we gave them accessibility to unlock value, get yield, just basic financial tools. And that's part of the whole financial inclusion, not of like in this micro like communities, but in macro level. For example, now anyone who is accessing over the 100 different access points into the Aave protocol globally, they get the same yield. So if I access from London, if someone accesses from Singapore, they have the same equal opportunity for that. And that's like financial inclusion, what we're doing. And I believe that decentralized finance mostly will be adopted through like maybe like institutions, financial intermediaries, could be part of software stack in big banks. But the main difference that we did now is that you have direct access into decentralized protocols if you don't like your service providers, which means that we, first time ever in history, we created finance as a human right after the barter economy. And that's very big.
Such an important part. And again, last year we were really fighting for freedom of speech, which I didn't understand what it really meant until it gets taken away from you.
Exactly.
And this year I was campaigning to be mayor of London, and I was in the middle of the street talking to my iPhone, and 5 police vans surrounded me, and they said, "You're banned from campaigning." And I thought, there's something wrong with that. So we fought back for free and fair elections. And then I'm looking about finance. I think it's one of the last human rights that doesn't exist for everyone in the world.
And privacy.
Yeah, privacy. Yeah, another one too. But like, again, it's one thing for you and I to have access to it, but if you're on the African subcontinent or in some of the places in Asia and India, you might not have that basic human right to borrow, lend, access to financial markets. And I always tell this tale of 2 women, like my mom's 76 and she's in California, and there's a 76-year-old woman in Ethiopia. They both were single mothers. They both raised 3 kids, but my mom had the option of investing in property that was stable. And this woman might have only had the option of investing in a local currency that was devalued, in property that was seized by the government, in a business that was made redundant because of a civil war. And now this woman in Ethiopia and my mom both have access to digital property and maybe to lending and borrowing through what you do. I mean, it really is a human right.
It is. And the thing is like kind of like essentially what DeFi is, it's a marketplace of liquidity and algorithms that allocate the liquidity in different kinds of opportunities. And algorithm is part of, let's say, our protocol is algorithm, and Maker, that's an algorithm essentially. It's basically code base. And first time ever, you have this kind of like an ocean of liquidity. So I think like when you think about DeFi and try to explain it to like a wider concept, what's happening here, DeFi is kind of like an ocean. So no one controls it. Like you cannot like claim ocean, which is like everyone's right? But then you have different kind of ports in different countries. Like those are the Coinbases of the world, the fintechs of the world, and banks of the world, and institutions. And like everyone has the access to the ocean through a port, for example. But you don't need a port. You can go and swim from the beach to the sea, and you have this accessibility. But the cool part is that anyone can contribute. Any part of the world, you can create a new innovation. And first time ever, you have developers building at the same time into the same financial infrastructure, the same kind of like software base. So it's very even difficult to create a parallel system where you want to create, okay, let's create a different kind of DeFi where we have a bit more decentralization, but we know the actors or some sort of like a mesh. because you have so much innovation going and this efficiency that end of the day, it's more efficient to use DeFi and it's ever growing because of innovation. So let's say the more capital is coming into the decentralized finance, the more innovation is going on. There's more demand again, and you have this constant cycle. And at some point, we can take the capital out of the DeFi by creating trust networks. So for example, I might need a collateral. I might need an Ethereum to borrow stablecoins, but I also can deposit Ethereum, borrow stablecoins, and give that borrowing power to someone else, for example, that I trust, maybe other part of the world. So I can delegate my borrowing power, and that person can actually draw those stablecoins and convert them national currencies and whatnot. And we can create this kind of like a trust networks on top of the decentralized finance layer. And I think it's just like a ability of like realizing that it's something, it's going to just be basis of the whole finance, and it's just software and it's good for everyone. It isn't going to remove traditional finance completely. It's just like traditional finance actually will be more efficient because they have better software now.
Right, and I want to talk about what you're doing with the banks right now. First, let me just zoom out really quick and talk to the people that just bought their first crypto, right? So my daughter, she's 17, my mom's got her Chainlink into some Tether and some Ethereum as well. And one of my students the other night in the DeFi Academy said, Brian, why is this important? Like, why do I need to lend or borrow? Maybe explain what is it at the core of what you do and why is that important? Because so many people new to this space don't understand finance. You know, like I worked in finance, and you know that borrowing and lending is the critical to the whole yield curve and all the infrastructure. But how do you tell people that just got here why what you're doing is so important when it's so simple?
Yeah, it's end of the day, like when you come to crypto, you have cryptographic assets. So they're like, if you buy, let's say, 1 Bitcoin or 1 Ethereum or 1,000 stable coins, that it will be 1,000 stable coins. And what the Aave protocol does is that it basically, when you deposit into the protocol, it starts to grow algorithmically the balance of your holdings. It means that the same way as you will go to a bank and you deposit your funds and you get interest on top of them. And it's an important part of the whole ecosystem because getting yield means that normally in economy you have inflation. So even if you have 100,000 in your bank account, let's say dollars, from 5 years from now, if there is inflation, that 100,000 becomes actually less in purchasing power. And getting yield is a way to actually fight against that, like a loss. Essentially, you're losing all the time money when you hold money. When you're not spending, you're losing money. And that's the thing. But also, when you're spending, you're losing money as well. So it's kind of like a dilemma. But what yield does, it basically fights against the inflation that we have. And inflation is because we put more money into the economy because there is more demand, but also in a way that we create the demand by pushing funds into the economy, meaning that when there's more money, you are spending that money somewhere, and that essentially gets the prices go up, which is inflation. So essentially, getting yield means that you get less screwed in the economy. That's why it's important.
Right, and that's important. So anybody that owns crypto, you could be growing that crypto. And again, compound interest, I think Ben Franklin in America always talked about, you get interest and then interest on your interest.
Exactly, compounding.
So it's, again, if you just let it sit, any asset anywhere, you're losing out.
You're losing, yeah.
Because someone could be using that and they'll pay you to use that.
Exactly. Banks aren't paying anything because they don't need the consumers' funds. They can go to different kind of channels. For example, Europe and elsewhere, you have this kind of way. For example, in England here, money is created from air. It's actually like 3% is cash. But for example, when I go and I need a mortgage, for example, that money doesn't exist. So for example, I get a £500,000 mortgage. If I get the mortgage, what means is that the bank has the ability to print that balance to you. And then it means that I get the 500,000 in pounds, plus I pay interest. Then I buy the house, for example. Now, once I bought the house, I'm left with the house and paying interest. So, but someone else gets the capital. So every single pound that is in circulation, someone is paying interest on that. This is something that people don't know, especially consumers, because they think economics works in the way it used to work, where you put money into the bank, someone borrows it. But if that will be the case, you will get more from banks as interest yield. But they can actually create that balance by themselves, so they don't need consumers' money. That's why decentralized finance creates an ecosystem where you can actually convert your assets to cryptographic stablecoins, put them into yield because there's constant innovation, new financial primitives, and that creates like a new market essentially. But that's why it's cool, like all this innovation.
Let's talk about stablecoins. Something I don't think anyone saw coming 5 years ago. And it's probably the biggest mover in this space of innovation and the biggest part of liquidity. And maybe you can talk about this. Again, one of my students the other night said, Brian, I bought some of the stablecoin and I'm really frustrated because Bitcoin's up, Ethereum's up, but my USDC, it's still $1.
Yeah.
And this is ridiculous. And I said, okay. I said, it's stable. And they said, well, that's not very interesting or exciting. And I thought, actually, sometimes boring is an asset. Sometimes boring is good. Sometimes fixed is really good. And I always talk about, I have 2 boys at home, they're 4 and 5 years old. And when it comes to babysitters, I choose the most boring babysitter possible because I want everything to be boring at my house. I don't want any volatility or weirdness going on. So people will pay for that stability.
Yeah.
Tell me about, maybe define what a stablecoin is and how has that market changed and how big of a market is it for you? And not only that, for the adoption of everybody into this space.
Yeah, I mean, stablecoin is a simple kind of like an asset that tracks.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.